Greetings, Canadian political pod listener. I'm your narrator, Gary, an artificial intelligence-generated voice. Exciting and serious sounding is what we typed in the AI voiceover input field. And boom, Gary exists. Hey, do you know what's not artificial? Not even one bit? The highly influential audiences, air quotes media podcasts, offer to its advertisers. And I say that with all the sincerity a machine learning, data-optimized, predictive network of interconnected neural nodes can muster. Whether your ad message is on Curse of Politics, the Burly, Hotel Pacifico, or the brand new Race to Replace, you will be reaching cabinet ministers, members of parliament, the political class, the C-suite, and corporate Canada, leading journalists, and tens of thousands of engaged Canadians. People saying this is a unique political moment is underselling it. Policy is under scrutiny. A party leader is being voted on. The Ontario election is underway. There will be a new prime minister. And then there's the guy living in the White House who calls us the 51st state. Does anyone remember another time like this? I'm instantly scouring millions of data points to answer my own rhetorical question. No, you do not. This is when you need to get your message to the decision makers. Email us at contact@airquotesmedia.com. You'll be dealing with Jill and Todd, who are real, not artificial at all people, and generally very friendly. Well, Jill is anyway. We're still deciding about Todd.
Welcome to Leg 4 of the Race to Replace. Every week we dig into the Liberal leadership race as 5 candidates now deke it out for the ultimate prize, one slightly obsolete Challenger jet. With you this week, we have got our policy czar, Tyler Meredith. We've got our ground game czar, Kattar, and myself, your polling czar, Dan Arnold. This week on the pod, we've got a senior official from the Karina Gould campaign on later on to talk a bit about that campaign and how it's unfolding. We also now know the number of registered Liberals. It's a big number. We'll talk about that and see if it actually means anything. We've also got a new game, Ruby or Pierre. And I guess we'll have to talk about tariffs because that's what people are talking about these days. Tyler, Vandana, how are you guys doing? Did you survive the roller coaster, our national roller coaster, the last couple days? You're doing all right?
I did oddly have anxiety yesterday, and I don't actually ever have that, but it's because everyone was messaging me about it, and then their stress was passing on to me, so I ended up being very anxious.
Yeah, it's been a great day, a great few days, actually, I should say, to be Canadian. And I think it's fascinating to watch the patriotism that's kind of emerged. I don't know if you guys agree with me about this, but like we obviously went through a very similar experience in 2018 when steel and aluminum was tariffed by Trump the first time around. This feels materially different. This feels like a whole pride movement in the country. And, setting aside partisanship, I know this is a podcast about Liberals. I'm happy to be a Canadian today.
I think also what I liked about this, it reminded me of the early days of COVID where everyone was together, everyone was like united, we all loved healthcare workers. So it was nice to see that type of unity again that I feel like we were being polarized and kind of apart for a long time. So that felt really good. And, thank you, Donald Trump, for bringing us all back together, clearly.
And like the early days of COVID, probably the last time people actually listened to Justin Trudeau and felt pride and not other emotions. So
we had a good few weeks.
Yeah.
It was Justin Trudeau without the beard.
That's true.
Like, he didn't have to. Previously, he had to suit that up in order to get the attention. Anyway.
All right. Well, let's jump into it. So I've got our headlines here, and let's start with the big number. We've got 400,000 registered Liberals eligible to vote. We did predictions last week. I was the closest, only off by 140,000. I work in a business with margins of error, so I think it's within the margin of error, my prediction, I guess. So I'll take the prize on that one here.
We never actually decided what the prize is. Just
you didn't bet on anything. It's too late now. You could have had me parading around like whatever jersey you wanted, but no. So no.
Yeah, Dan, we're not Oilers fans. Just to be very clear, despite Tim Krupa trying to convince all of us, we're not Oilers fans.
It's still my backup team.
There we go.
That's it.
So the lists of those 400,000, if you signed up, your email address has been shared with all the campaigns. You've probably been bombarded over and over again, multiple times a day from all the campaigns with the emails. Vandana, we've talked about phases before. I guess what are the campaigns doing now? Like what do they spend the next week doing now that they have access to all of these contact information from other liberals?
Start with the basics. I remember the day membership cut off, and then not realizing with my first leadership that I still had to do work every day, which means I had to find ways to get through those lists and still convince people to vote for the person whose team I was on. So that's what's going to happen. People are going to go through membership lists, they're going to make calls, they're going to see, and there's going to be a lot of duplicates too. So sometimes people say yes to a lot of people, like who's actually on your team. We had a lot of that too in the 2013 leadership campaign, just to find out who's what. I remember that also in the OLP leadership campaign. My husband has a story where he was at a voting center. I know Sandra Patello, he was with her in the car, and they were like arguments over the same like Punjabi Sikh families as to like who signed up for who. But for an example, on Persuasion, what I think is going to be most important, I'm going to give three little analysis of the candidates, is changing public opinion about yourself. And Dan, I'm going to tell a story that you can jump in on because you know it very well. But in 2013, leading up to the PM, like he was the leader, they kept saying, just not ready. And that permeated through everybody's psyche. He's just not ready. Nice hair, though. A lot of those comments was the interviewers. And the number one rule really usually is don't reaffirm your opponent's attack on you. And then we tried something, and I think Dan, you did this in focus groups, where you had the PM walking in front of Parliament Hill saying, Stephen Harper says I'm not ready. You know what I'm not ready for? I'm not ready for, like climate change and for a recession and all these things. And I believe that did very well. Am I correct, Dan?
It did so well that Jerry Butts called the ad agency from the back room as he was watching the groups and upped the ad buy for that campaign.
Amazing. And this is actually a reminder for me from Marlene Floyd. So thank you for that. And the reason I share this is every candidate is going to have what they want to convince people for. So Mark Carney, people are thinking he's an elitist, that he's like Ignatieff. No offense to friends who enjoy Michael Ignatieff. But like, and you see, he's not doing a lot of media. He's done a few things on tariffs. He hasn't been out there. But what you're seeing is him in pubs.
Hopefully he'll do our podcast.
Hopefully. Lots of people. I've noticed he's ditching his blazer sometimes. He has this like sweater with like a collared shirt underneath, which is lovely. And not that he's trying to be someone who's not, but he knows his goal is to change people's public perception of him. And if he does interviews, I think he'll be again in a suit and tie. He'll have that look to him, and it'll make people think, oh, this is an elitist guy. I'm not sure he's out of touch. But I see him. I just saw a great post on Instagram from Kitchener, and the crowd's cheering. And it seemed like he's looking like an everyday guy. I would say for Karina Gould, she's trying to show that I can lead. Like, while you may not think or consider me as the front two runners, I'm trying to lead. So she's doing a lot of long form media pieces. She's doing a lot of like podcasts. She's doing a lot of like influencer work. I've seen with a lot of suburban moms groups. So that's what she's doing to help convince people and trying to get them on side. And Freeland, I find she's actually just trying to actually keep the ballot question as who's most important to deal with Trump and who's most likely to deal with Trump. And I know we'll talk about this later, but she's doing a lot of just reminding people top of mind that she's done this before. She's negotiated with war. And to liberal voters, like, sure, maybe I don't have more MP endorsements than somebody else. Maybe I'm not having these big rallies, but I can get the job done. And that's what she's doing. What I find interesting that she's doing and Frank Bayless is doing, I've noticed her doing a lot of outreach. I've seen her doing something for Black History Month, Lunar New Year. I've also seen her do a lot of multicultural media, and having watched her since 2013, I haven't seen her engage that much on that stuff. So Red FM, Y Media, Parvasi, Fairchild, and Frank Bayless is leading on a lot of Black community supports. He's doing stuff with the Arab community. I've seen stuff with the Sikh community. And why is that important? So part of Persuasion is also trying to get to other niche issues. We're talking about tariffs right now. Donald Trump, that's the most important thing. But I remember going to an event with the PM. Masai Jerry was there, Wes Hall, and a number of Black entrepreneurs. And they said to us, actually, what we need is a Black bank. And they talked about the issues with capital funding and their lack thereof. And then we put some programs together for that. When we did stuff with the Sikh community, we heard that they wanted direct flights to Amritsar. So when you hit these communities and segments, you can get to other issues that also matter to them. And they're issues that, yes, they care about tariffs, they care about the economy. But if you can add, and this may not be the first thing you put on your platform, but little things that show that they've been heard by you, that can help. So that's a really great persuasion piece. So if you can hear that from the community side, you can go on multicultural media and talk about it. So those liberals who may have signed up for someone else might be like, well, Freeland's actually talking about my issues. So maybe I will vote for her. So I think that's very interesting.
Okay, so you'd say air war to change perceptions or reinforce good perceptions of yourself. And then in terms of ground game, a lot of
Yeah.
outreach, a lot of checking names on the list, a lot of
Yep.
multicultural. Makes sense.
Yep.
Tyler, what do you think of your thoughts on the number? Because I do want to pause on
Yeah.
that for a second. In 2013, as you mentioned, there was 300,000 people who signed up to be registered liberals. Now, that was a much longer race, but you're running to be third party leader. This time it's for prime minister. So I don't know if 400,000 is a better or worse number when you kind of scope things out. I will make the point though that in 2013, only 104,000 people actually voted at the end of the day. It's not a big ask to sign up with your email address, no money's down on the payment. You actually have to turn people out. And if it's only a 1 in 3 turnout rate like we saw last time, turnout becomes very important. While 400,000 is a big number, it is still far less than signed up for Pierre Poilievre. He had 675,000 paid members sign up in that race for the Conservatives, and over 400,000 voted. So I don't know if this is a good number or a bad number, but it's the number we got. And I guess the next stage is kind of turning those people out.
So, I mean, I think we got to keep all of this in context, right? So we've had a much shorter period in which those signups could happen. So you're the pollster, Dan, but I bet if we did this on an day adjusted basis, we've probably signed up more people through our process this time around than the Conservatives did last time. I could be wrong on that, but it would be interesting to do that analysis. The other thing I would say is, look, all three of us are, political practitioners. We were off by an order of magnitude, and that was even still with really good intelligence that we were getting from people inside the party and from MPs as they were reporting things. And I just think it speaks to the fact that it's probably not one organized campaign that signed all of these people up. I think the degree of what we saw happen in the short period of time is probably an organic movement. Mostly, I think, driven by kind of energy by the decision of the prime minister to leave and a bit of a kind of sigh of relief in Liberal Canada about maybe there is hope for the next election and maybe the Liberal Party is in fact a vehicle to stop Pierre Poilievre. So it's actually really exciting to see all of this happen. I think in terms of some of what Vandana said, what I found interesting is, and again, we're only a week out from the cutoff, so obviously there's still a bit of time to go in this respect. But I haven't really seen the pivot yet of the candidates towards the Persuasion. They're obviously doing events, they're out engaging with specific regions, but I haven't seen that kind of broad swath effort on the part of the candidates to try to speak to the mainstream of a large mass of new Liberals that have come in. Because if those are in fact people that vote at much lower propensities, and I think certainly all of us saw in the recent Ontario Liberal leadership race that the dynamic you cited there, Dan, is true. Not only in 2013, but even recently in the Ontario Liberal leadership race, where new members voted a much, much lower proportion. They're much harder to drive out because they're just weakly attached to the party, right? In the way that longtime members who show up at EDAs, who volunteer on campaigns, who've been a Liberal for a long time, have a sense of investment in the decision of the party. I'm surprised that we haven't yet seen the candidates kind of get out and try to define a mainstream kind of agenda. And again, we're now post the Trump tariff, so maybe there is space to do that. But I'm just surprised that there hasn't been more mainstreaming by the candidates.
By mainstream, do you mean like going on media?
Yeah, going on media, but also like with a specific pitch of what they would try to do and what their campaign is, right? And again, I hate to be the policy guy here, but we have a sum total of like one major policy plank from one candidate, two maybe policy planks from another candidate, three policy planks from Karina Gould. Like I'm surprised again at the stage that this is moving kind of somewhat slowly. It's actually it needs a bit more life.
Even worse for me. I feel as a ground organizer, I actually wouldn't waste time on that. And my media friends are going to kill me. They always are bugging me about like, why aren't people doing more media? But I think like they really need to talk to the base, because going back to Dan's point, getting out the vote, you need these voters motivated. And media have a million of things to talk about. They're talking about tariffs over and over again. They're covering those things. I actually find this week with tariffs, they're not covering leaderships that often. They're actually, I mean, Tyler, you and I both do a lot of media. We're talking about like, you're talking about like tariffs and the economy, not so much leadership pitches last week, right?
It's true.
So like I would continue speaking to Liberals and saying, especially if I'm a front runner person, I would be like, please don't think that, because then you won't come out to vote. You need to vote. And I think if you want to capitalize on the amount of people that signed up, because they may not always realize what you have to do to actually go forward and actually get out the vote, that's going to be more important. So I do wonder if we sat in those rooms that if you would hear some of those persuasive pieces, which actually you might be better at because on media you have a certain persona to fill. But if you're talking to liberals and you can have one-on-one conversations, take more time, maybe they will actually go further that way.
Well, and we're starting to see the candidates do regional tours, right? So last week we talked about Mark Carney going through Quebec. We've seen recently in the last few days he's been doing a tour in Atlantic Canada, obviously because, there's a number of votes out there, especially because there isn't an Atlantic Canadian now that Jaime Batiste has taken himself off the ballot. There's not an Atlantic Canadian on the ballot, and those are ridings up for grabs. So I take your point. I think there is that persuasion that's happening. It's just perhaps happening a little bit behind view. And what's interesting, we didn't talk about this, but the party has a milestone where it has to set out the logistics of the vote within 27 days of the vote. So we're getting close to that timeline, which by my math would suggest we're probably sometime around the 10th of February, right? And I think, but once we get to see those details, how we're going to vote, when we're going to vote, is it all going to happen on the same day? I think that will then inform a little bit of the way in which the candidates themselves will engage in the final stretch.
Yeah, can I throw a couple of other timelines on the table here since you mentioned it, Tyler? So
Sure.
we don't, as you mentioned, we don't know the process yet for voting, if this is going to be digital, in person, smoke flares, whatever. And they do have to probably announce that within the next week. We also have a big money call coming in this Friday. Candidates will have to put 125,000 non-refundable. So far, they've put in one non-refundable and one refundable deposit. And Jaime Batiste, as you mentioned, dropped out basically before the first non-refundable deposit was done. So it wouldn't surprise me if some of the candidates have trouble hitting this deadline. And then the second non-refundable deadline is February 17th. That's for another 125,000. So this field could be narrowing quite quickly in the coming weeks. The party also announced that they are going to be doing two debates, one in English, one in French. They haven't given the dates yet, but they will be
Yay, only two. Sorry, guys.
Well, we had this debate last week. I would say I'm a little disappointed in this.
I'm very happy.
Dan and I
party.
lost that.
Good
Dan
job,
and I
party.
lost that.
Yeah, they were not listening to our persuasive pitches last week on that. But those debates will be, they said, after the 17th. So it could be a 2-person debate. It could be a 3-person debate. I don't know where we'll be at that point, but it may not be 5 candidates on stage by the time we get to those debates. And since we're doing numbers, people like to get the endorsement numbers here, which actually haven't changed much since last week. We have 59 for Carney, including Jaime Batiste now is one of those ones. 27 for Freeland plus herself, 2 for Gould plus herself. So not a lot of change on the endorsements. I think the Carney campaign kind of saved up a bunch and did a concerted effort to roll them out for a period. And now I kind of get the sense that any endorsements that come in are pretty organic endorsements as candidates, as MPs are just kind of making up their minds and going to campaigns. I don't think we're holding back endorsements. Maybe there's a Dominic LeBlanc endorsement being held back or a big one by somebody, but I think by and large at this point, anything's kind of coming in just as MPs make up their minds and decide who to support.
I will note that Chrystia Freeland has put Lloyd Axworthy up. And for people who are global affairs nerds like I am, that could be exciting for some. I mean, he had a lot of intense portfolios back under Chrétien. So, I mean, she's still putting something out there. It's not the same. Same thing with Karina Gould, what I mentioned about Tyler last week. These could still play in other places.
And Lloyd Axworthy, let's admit, he's a big name in Manitoba politics, right? He's still a pretty large deal for the Manitoba Liberal Party, and it might have some sway in a little bit in places.
You'll get nothing and like it. A talent of mine is that I can quote damn near 100% of the character dialogue from the movie Caddyshack. It's a dubious skill. That particular line is from Judge Smales, played by the great Ted Knight, to his nephew Spaulding, who can't decide whether to get a cheeseburger or a hot dog. But I think you can reasonably apply it to the battle for consumer choice and genuine competition in high-speed internet service. You'll recall that a federal cabinet order suggested our presenting sponsor TELUS be barred from accessing the fiber networks required to offer those services to new customers in Ontario and Quebec. The upshot? Consumers in those markets could lose out on lower prices, 19% lower in Ontario compared to a year ago, and also miss out on innovative service bundles. But what they're not doing is sitting quietly and liking it. I'll get to that part in a second. The two corporate giants in the region, the Bell and Rogers duopoly, let's call it Brogers, have been getting their say and for the moment their way. Their message has been amplified through the megaphone of a proxy organization, the CNOC, Competitive Network Operators of Canada, who've put forward arguments that closely mirror Broadger's own. A concerning alignment with the very entities they were meant to challenge. So whose interests are being served here? Consumers or corporations? I mentioned people are not sitting quietly and accepting all of this. There are over 200,000 signatures on a petition supporting TELUS's entry into Ontario and Quebec. These are 200,000 voices representing families and businesses who clearly don't like what they've been handed for years now, limited options and high prices. 200,000 voices demanding change in the form of true competition. You can add yours at demandmoreinternetchoice.ca. The question here isn't whether competition is good for consumers. It always is. The real question comes down to this. Are we going to listen to those voices or continue to protect the status quo?
So, Tyler, you've been begging to talk about policy. You've been frustrated that there's no policy in this campaign. Yes. You've been ripping out your hair because candidates are not making policy announcements.
I still have pretty lush hair.
So I'm going to let you talk about policy here because we did have a pretty big announcement from Mark Carney last Friday. Carney said he's going to axe the tax. And we had a segment 2 weeks ago, our unanimous consent segment, when we talked about axing the tax. And at the time, Vandana and myself were both saying from political reasons, yes, let's get rid of the carbon tax. You were kind of on the fence. You refused to give us a yay or nay. You said, I want to wait and see what the policy is before I decide if it's a good policy or not. So now that you've seen what Carney put out there, maybe give a quick recap of what he said. And is it a good policy? Is it a bad policy? What's your sense on what he announced?
So thanks for putting me on the spot. So yes, let's do a quick rundown. So first and most importantly, he did say that he would get rid of the retail carbon price, and he described the reasons for that as being largely that the policy has become too divisive. He does say, although he doesn't say it directly, but he does say polluters will still pay, that he intends, we can kind of read through the tea leaves as wanting to maintain the industrial carbon price. You'll recall that I said last time, it will be interesting to see, does he get rid of the retail and keep the industrial? So he does keep the industrial. Doesn't say whether that number is going to increase over time. I suspect it might, but he's not given any ammunition to Pierre Poilievre on that front. But the fact that he's kept the industrial is important because it's an important part of how you maintain the incentive structure for large industrial emitters to continue to invest in things like technology and carbon capture and storage in order to actually to sequester at source a significant amount of emissions. So that's kind of point number one. Point number two, he makes a nod towards wanting to kind of what I would say soup up a lot of the relatively popular green investments that the government has made, particularly those that are focused on the retail side with consumers. So the Greener Homes Canada strategy, he wants to expand that. He wants to enhance and continue the $5,000 ZEV rebates, although he mentions that they would be targeted on low and middle income households. He also says that he wants to provide additional incentives for Canadians that make the right choices, whether that's doing insulation in your house or buying an energy efficient appliance. And then the third piece, which is interesting, is he wants to continue the output based pricing system, which is important again from an export import perspective. And he also wants to institute a border carbon adjustment. Now, border carbon adjustments are a very nerdy term of basically saying you're going to tax, and this is also kind of an interesting segue into what we'll talk about later, tariffs. It's an interesting way to apply a tariff basically to dirty things that you import, whether it's steel, cement, etc. That's actually a really good thing. It's something that Canada had started working with the U.S. administration on under Biden. Biden obviously didn't have a chance to implement it. The EU is going to be implementing it soon. And then the fourth piece is really about how you drive investment, which is implementing a very nerdy thing called a taxonomy. I won't get into details as to what that is, but that's something that's been floating around within the Department of Finance under Christopher Freeland for a long time. So there's
we're going to be releasing a director's cut version of this podcast episode for those who want to hear about that. Tyler will give you more details on what that is.
I'll stop here. All that to say, it's a really thick, detailed announcement. So from that perspective, I give him marks. I will have to say, though, there are elements of it that even I find a little incomprehensible and not understandable, particularly his carbon market. And you may have seen Pierre Poilievre, I think, use that of all things to kind of beat up on him, given a somewhat cringy interview that he did, let's say, with CTV Atlantic, where he said, I don't know about you, Steve, but I don't buy a lot of steel. So anyway, we'll see how that cuts. I think at the end of the day, he obviously hit the mark in terms of he needed to present something that was serious, that showed that there was an alternative plan. I think he did it in a way that, at least if you're an environmental voter who's admired the kind of climate leadership that the government has made and thought that it was important, that there's a serious plan that can substitute for it, that doesn't put the emphasis on the consumer. That being said, there are elements of it, again, that I just think are not necessarily well explained. And in some ways, you could maybe make the case politically, setting aside the policy elements of this, that he overthought it, right? He just needed to say, I'm against the carbon tax, kind of like what you guys were saying a couple of weeks ago. So from the pure politics of it, he may not necessarily have landed it exactly the way he wanted to. But I think if you were looking for a reassurance that a Liberal Party is going to continue to have serious climate leadership, I think there's a decent plan there.
So can I add an overlay on what I think it means for Path to Victory? I think, to simplify what Tyler said, if I were to take that and be like, how do I get people to vote for it? I would put, if I was a Carney's team, I would put Facebook ads pertaining to the climate. You want to save money at your house? Here's we'll put this incentive out. Like, the problem with the carbon pricing issue is that's not effective. It's just that people need buy-in, and average everyday people need to know, like, how are you saving me money? And they don't want to think about the future. I think for Mark Carney, I would put these on ads and I would target progressives. There's been a lot of talk about like Carney being a center right person. I think actually the first policy put out, being an environment, shows he's actually progressive. And I think I would take those, maybe make them really short, retail them, put them on Facebook ads, share them with liberals, and be like, this is how we can get the voters to vote for me. I'm going to save money, but also protect the environment. 2 lines.
So not the director's cut. You're saying we should not turn the director's cut into ads.
No, darling, you make that. I will make it short and easy and make people vote for us for it. Thank you. That's what this is. Me and Tyler is like, when we're in the war room, this is what it sounds like. Usually Tyler and I.
Yeah, I think simply you're making big polluters pay, and you're giving people incentives to make good energy efficient choices. And everyone likes things like rebates for insulation and appliances. And this is how I would change it if you asked me, like, how would you change the carbon tax? So I think they're on the right path there. Mm-hmm. I've got a question for you, Tyler. How easy is it to get rid of the carbon tax? Like, if he wins the leadership on March 8th, can he just snap his fingers and like 2 weeks later the carbon tax is gone? Or is there some lengthy bureaucratic process? Like, by the time the next election comes around, if the next election is in April, will it be possible for the Liberal leader to stand up and say the carbon tax is no more? Or is it still kind of like a thing where it would take a lot of time to phase out? Do you know the answer on this?
So I should know the answer in detail, partly because I helped shepherd that piece of legislation through the 2018 budget.
You just never thought about killing it at the time.
I never, yeah. So I don't want to give the wrong answer, but I believe that you'll have to eventually legislate the change. But I believe there are provisions that the governor and council is able to pass a regulation that at least would pause and undo. But they're going to have to go back and change the legislation, at least to remove that whole section around retail carbon pricing. Because if anyone wants to go back and look at it, the legislation that underpins the pricing system is hundreds of pages long. It's very, very long. In fact, we'll get into this at maybe another point in time. But there's a very funny story about the naming and title of that legislation.
All right, we'll save that for the director's cut as well too.
Dan, can I ask you a question though, as the pollster here? So when you say make polluters pay, even if the underlying element of that is there's still actually a tax, it's just not a retail tax that you and I see, kind of in the way that there's a tariff tax, right? It's just not paid at retail as a separate line item. How does that test with people? Like, do people, if Pierre Poilievre makes a case going forward that industrial carbon pricing is actually still a carbon tax of a different name, does he have a leg to stand on in terms of the public sentiment?
I mean, look, I asked questions directly on this, and you have 60-70% of people who would support the industrial carbon tax. And because you think of a factory spewing pollution in the air, and nobody likes that. And they think that business actually can change their behavior more than they can themselves. If you ask people about like what will actually be effective too. So yeah, I think fighting on the industrial tax isn't a bad spot to be on. Again, it's like, environment's not the number one issue for people, but end of the day, it's not a bad ground to be fighting on. I think Canadians by and large think that big businesses should be able to, or should have to pay if they're going to pollute?
Because we all watched the Smoggies back then. Remember that show? That's what I think about. You guys don't know what I'm talking about. Okay, never mind. That's fine.
I made a Captain Planet reference our first episode, so we're in the same
Okay.
era there. Do people want to say anything on tariffs? I mean, I think obviously a lot happened. Does this impact the leadership race at all? I think when people are talking about tariffs, it's probably good for Freeland. That seems to be her wheelhouse a bit, but I don't know. Does this change anything?
So I think it changes for the Liberal Party overall because it's effectively changed the ballot box question from affordability, from carbon tax, but everyone's talking about Trump and tariffs. So you've changed that, and people are just thinking about that. Although I'm not convinced, and this is just like talking to people at work, it worked out for Chrystia Freeland so much because someone at work messaged me. It was actually yesterday. It feels like today feels like Thursday, but and said, well, do you know what's going to happen? I'm like, I don't know. Like, hopefully there'll be a deal. And they said to me, well, looks like Carney's stock went up. And I was surprised, and I was like, interesting. You don't think it's Chrystia? And they're like, well, I feel like this is a different type of Trump. Like we've seen Chrystia. He said he doesn't like her. Like, I don't know. Can they negotiate? So like, I don't know. I would just go with Carney. This person is a liberal, but isn't convinced who to vote for yet. So I was surprised. So I actually don't know amongst liberals. I'm not sure how the average voter feels because they were watching CNN, other things she's on. But I think for the voters, like, I don't know if it's actually working out for her in that sense. I think for some reason people still see Carney as someone who can deal with the economy and they connect that to tariffs.
I agree. I've heard similar things in passing and talking with friends. I'll say one thing though. We are assuming in this discussion that tariffs are off, and I don't know that we can make that assumption just yet because I think it's also possible we get to the beginning of March and Trump says, "Well, I'm going to have the report coming in April on the renegotiation of CUSMA, so I'm going to start to slap some tariffs on just as an initial volley to kind of put Canada back on its toes." Right? We know that he tries to use tariffs at every opportunity to advance leverage in whatever direction he can. So I think it's possible we could actually be in a bit of a crisis moment right as we're basically voting in the Liberal leadership and just before a new prime minister comes in and replaces Trudeau, right? That tariffs are put in place. And in fact, in some ways, Trump would want to do that if he were being rational. He's not rational, but if he were being rational, he might want to do that, right? Because it's going to put a new administration in chaos on its potentially first day in office. And so I don't know that this plot line is done. And I think it's interesting as we now have two debates that we're going to be dealing with. I think Carney has said that he supports dollar for dollar tariffs. All of the candidates seem to be lining up around that particular position. But he hasn't really defined kind of what he would do differently in Canada's posture, and maybe doesn't need to do anything differently, but I just think he needs to fill in a little bit more of the details on that front. Because I agree with you, Vandana. Like, I think people are potentially leaning in the direction that they're open to him in seeing his economic credentials in this light.
I'm Hamas, and this is Simon, and we live in Surrey. We started hosting on Airbnb because we thought we had the spare room, and why not share it with people? When our guests come in, first thing usually they ask is, I'm really hungry, it's been a really long flight, can you recommend a place? Usually Simon is really good with that. He knows all the good spaces. Because we got a lot of good reviews and people commented on the overall look of the space, I was like, okay, maybe I can do this for a living. It actually gave me the courage to start school in interior design. It made such an impact on us financially, and I don't know, I think we're happier because we started Airbnb for sure.
We've got a new segment this week called Ruby or Pierre. People complained we didn't talk enough about Ruby Dalla last week, so I've got some Ruby Dalla content here for all of her many Instagram fans. What we're going to do is a little game. I'm going to give each of you back and forth a statement that's been given in the last couple of weeks, and you're going to tell me, was a statement said by Ruby Dalla or was it said by Pierre Poilievre? And I guess we didn't think of a prize for this one either, too, but maybe we'll get a signed picture from Ruby or something for the winner here. So let me start with you, Tyler, on this one. Who said recently, the Liberal Party is broken? Was it Ruby Dalla or Pierre Poilievre?
Ruby Dalla.
Ding. 1 point for Tyler.
All right.
Lead. All right. Over to you, Vandana. This is a quote. World Economic Forum elites are again meeting to talk about how you will own nothing and be happy. An agenda carbon tax Carney and Chris just share. Who said that?
I'm gonna go with Pierre.
And that was Pierre. He's more the World Economic Forum type.
That's
Still
what
on
I
that,
figured.
still on
That
that
was the
train.
tell.
So we're tied at 1. Round 2 here. Okay, back to you, Tyler. Self-serving global elitist carbon tax Carney has been pulling Justin Trudeau's puppet strings for years.
Oh, that's Pierre. Come on now.
Ding, that is also a Pierre one. And then over to you, Vandana. Mark Carney has always believed in the carbon tax. He helped design it. We do not need Trudeau 2.0.
I think I'm going. Beginning sounds like Pierre. The end sounds like Groupie, but I'm gonna go with Pierre.
Here. Oh, that's
An AI mashup.
That's a Ruby Dalla quote there, unfortunately. So Tyler, by a 2-1 score, you win this little game here. So you didn't win the membership last week, but you get a prize here this week.
So I think the premise of this is that, and this would be very interesting to explore if hopefully Dr. Ruby Dalla comes on our podcast. We invite Dr. Ruby Dalla to come on our podcast. But I think the premise of this was really to explore the fact that like she's leaned into wanting to be, as she self-describes, the female Donald Trump of Canada, right? And I don't know, that's an interesting strategy. I'm not sure it'll cut ice with liberals, but we'll see.
Yeah.
Safe to say she's very, very aggressive in her posture and tone this leadership race. She's not in it to make friends and set herself up for a friendly appointment from the next liberal leader, I think is safe to say.
I mean, every time I think I've seen the last of her, she shows up again. So, hey.
We'll see. Okay.
Again, we invite you, Dr. Ruby Dalla, if you wish to come on our podcast.
All right. I want to do, we started doing some questions last week that people wanted us to talk about here. We have time for, I think, one more this week here. Alec Jolly writes in, would love an in-depth exploration of the role that Corrina, well, he said Jaime, but I guess Jaime's gone now, but think of Batiste, or not, your picklebar friend, Tyler. And other non-favorite candidates could play in the one-member, one-vote system. So if we assume this is a race where we have frontrunners and then we have other candidates, what's the role of the candidates who maybe aren't going to be at the top at the end of the day? What's the role they play in this leadership here?
Well, I think it depends on segments. You know, if Corrina can effectively really bring forward the youth, and especially suburban middle class women, which Dan, I think you'll agree with me based on polling that liberals need to get back. That's pretty strong. So you can bring those. It's not the same way a delegated convention can be, where you can like bring people along with you. But she definitely has play and sway in that sense, and also to bring those issues to fruition. So you know, whatever issues she chimes in on, if it's something that's very niche, it could put pressure on the two candidates to like bring up those issues as well. Even though everyone's talking about tariffs, she would have something that's specific for parents or caregivers or youth. LPC put out their youth campaign. Maybe she champions some of that, and that becomes a big piece. But if no one gets on the first ballot over 50%, and let's say she does very well, and let's say she actually does better than Miss Freeland, like there's a path, right? So I think like if you don't get over 50%, like I look at, you know, where Nate and Yasser, like Bonnie Crombie said, go to 30 rounds. You never know if that many people follow you, like it's possible.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, I was going to say that the Nate and Yasser example is interesting. So this was in the provincial Liberal leadership race. Bonnie Crombie was the front runner, and then Yasser Naqvi and Nate Erskine-Smith basically made a deal where they told their supporters, mark the other one of us second choice on your ballot. And, you know, I think at the end, about 2/3 of Yasser's vote did go to Nate after Yasser dropped out. Yeah, so there is certainly an ability to move people. It's not like a delegated convention. Like I remember back in the 2006 leadership race in Montreal, I was a Gerard Kennedy delegate, and we all just marched across the floor to Stéphane Dion. It was like a 95% conversion rate. You're never going to see that type of second choice conversion in a one member, one vote. But if you got to a situation, I guess, where, you know, Corrina and Christia were actually looking like they were on par, maybe you could see some kind of agreement like that. If not, then I think you have the traditional kind of just calling through and try to get second choice numbers, right? So as the campaigns are identifying supporters, they're making phone calls, they're calling through lists. And if you're in the Mark Carney campaign and you get somebody who is supporting Karina Gould or Frank Bayless or even Ruby Dalla, you're probably asking them, well, who's your second choice? And would you think about marking Mark as your second choice? So that's the kind of traditional approach. And if any of these candidates don't make it to the actual end of the road here, as was the case with Jaime Batiste, then I think, there's an opportunity there for them to actually try to bring some of their people they signed up on board. I don't know if Jaime Batiste is making calls to the people he signed up to bring them to Carney, or he just did a public endorsement. But if you actually had somebody drop out and put a little effort behind it, they probably could bring some of their people they signed up with them.
But in his public endorsement, he did talk a lot about reconciliation. And he talked about how he felt that Carney would put those on the forefront and he would prioritize them. So that in itself, for anyone that's a key voting issue. And Mark Miller said that too, actually, on an interview that he did, that Carney cares about reconciliation. Anyone who thought about that, anyone who would have been influenced by Jaime, would be like, okay, well, if you feel this way, and I believe that you these issues, I will vote for Mark Carney. So I think that's also another possibility. The other thing that you can do too, like even if they drop, someone can say to their supporter group, if they have a huge one, like, I believe the person who believes in those issues will be X person, Chrystia Freeland, for example, and convince people to like move towards that way. So, but you can't conversion rate the way you do with the delegated convention.
Can I just say, so I was very involved in the Yasser's campaign, and I just want to kind of comment on places. Yes, we were. Yes, we're all one big family. We're all helping Bonnie Crombie now. But I'll just say on the tactic, Dan, that you referenced. So we were actually surprised, I would say, at how effectively that tactic worked, in the sense that about 70% of people carried over. And I think the fact that 70% of people carried over, my assumption at the time was that this would be a tactic validated in subsequent leadership races. We'll see if that's true this time around. But what was interesting that we found was we actually had several hundred of Yasser supporters who just marked a ballot for him. He was the only top ranked name, and they didn't rank a second choice for Nate, so that they would carry over to him. And that wasn't enough for Nate to have fully potentially leapfrogged Bonnie on the final ballot, but it would have made it really, really close. Remember, Bonnie only won by about 2 or 3%. Mm-hmm. So these kinds of things, like in the sense of, can you actually get all of your people not only to mark in the way that you want, but also to actually engage in a ranked ballot, is really mechanically quite important. And I'll say one thing, which is Milton Chan, who was chairing and running Yasser's leadership campaign, is now chairing and running Chrystia Freeland's campaign with Tom Allison, and he knows how that tactic worked. I would not be surprised if there may be some conversations at some point as we get closer to the race, whether or not this is a tactic that will appear in this leadership.
Interesting. Okay. One other thing I want to talk about here, as I mentioned, we have a senior official from the Karina Gould campaign coming on later to give us an interview. And I think this will be a series, hopefully, as we get you've put your invitation out for Ruby Dalla, Tyler. Maybe other candidates and people from their campaigns will join us as well too. But whenever we have them on, I do want to kind of talk a little bit about their path to victory. Not so much the path to victory in a leadership, but the path to victory in a general election. So yes, it's probably a long shot that Corrina does win, but as a thought exercise, let's say she wins the leadership race. What does she need to do to win a general election? What are the things she should be talking about, focusing on? If you were giving her advice the day she wins the leadership race, what would the advice be?
So I'll go first. I think, her clear advantage in this race, right, if she wins and becomes the leader, is that she's the millennial candidate. She's younger than Pierre Poilievre. She's been in politics almost a decade less than Pierre Poilievre. And she has the whole family experience of having been a millennial in this housing market, which she, I'm sure, can talk about and will talk about. And so I think she's got to do something, particularly from a policy standpoint, to differentiate herself from Pierre in that sense, and potentially to throw overboard some stuff from the government. I think it's interesting. We didn't talk about it in the headlines, but she put out actually a really interesting policy announcement earlier this week as well. It got kind of sidelined because of because of all the stuff on tariffs. But she was proposing to cut the GST by 1 percentage point for the next year and to pay for it in part, not entirely, but in part by raising corporate taxes. That's an interesting combination, especially in an environment where we might be needing a recovery effort. It's also something that speaks directly to affordability. It's not entirely obviously focused on millennials, but it's a certainly really big cost of living play. It's big, it's costly. It's probably about $5.5 billion. But it's a really big play. And so I think she will have to tell her story about how she is the millennial in this race, because I think the biggest challenge she will face is even if she wins the hearts and minds of liberals, she's still probably the person with the lowest name recognition of all the candidates.
So it's a top line. I think she has to show a fighting position. Like she's talk about Trump, she has to talk about how she's fighting for Canada and show that stance. I think the problem that she'll have is not just that she doesn't have as much recognition, but we've seen Chrystia Freeland in that scenario. We've seen her with hard hats. We've seen her in the hero mode in terms of like tours and stuff. But with Karina Gould, and she is young, she is a mom. People will automatically have a bias and misrepresent her or think she can't do it. So I think showing that how strong she is. And I'll tell a story. She was a parliamentary secretary for international development, spoke on the House. I was waiting for Nafty Baines, and his dad called and said, "Who's this woman? She sounds like a minister." So hearing her speak, she is very choppy in the House. She's very much like a shark in the House. So seeing more action so people can see her like that is going to be important from a top line. From a ground perspective, women. Get women for Corrina. Get moms for Corrina. Get millennials for Corrina. Get those groups, capitalize on them, and move them, and hit. Dan, I've talked over the years about this, but Quebec, Greater Toronto area, Greater Vancouver area, parts of the Atlantic, but also urban prairie. So if you can just even get those segments of the population to vote for you in flux as much as possible, that would be what you would need to do.
Yeah, I think from a winning coalition perspective and a pathway to victory perspective, the natural group should be going for would be young people, millennial women, suburban moms, like those demographics. Yeah. Just from vibes will like her. And then obviously there'll be brilliant policy to layer on and appeal to them and all that. But ultimately, I think there's an appeal there that would work to her advantage. I do agree with you, though. I think the thing she'd have to figure out first and foremost, if we think that the Trump question is going to be lingering and the tariff question is going to be lingering, how do you break probably what would be perceptions that she's not, as tough as some of these other people? She doesn't look like somebody who could stand up to Donald Trump. And this is what I remember back with Justin Trudeau in 2017, the first Trump presidency. We would do focus groups in the lead up to his first meeting with Trump. And people were like, "Oh, Justin's a nice guy, but like Trump's a tough negotiator. He's going to steamroll him." And then Trudeau goes down to DC, has the most important 20-second handshake in the history of his political career, and comes back from that meeting. And suddenly in focus groups, people were like, "Oh my God, Justin went down to DC and Trump tried to pull his hand and Trudeau looked him in the eye and said, 'You're not going to pull Canada around.'" And like, he just created this vibe that he could stand up to Trump. And I think I think Corrina would have to probably do a Trump visit within the first week or two after she wins to kind of establish those bona fides on the international stage and make her seem a bit more credible on those types of questions.
Yeah, I think who she surrounds herself by. So unfortunately, imagery is a big piece of politics, especially today. But if she still has strong people around her and shows her as a team and leading a team, I think that can be helpful. So keeping Dom where he is, keeping Jolie where she is, and showing that strong fighting stance, I think that'll still help.
Do you think okay, now we're getting into pure speculation territory. Do you think she would be able to actually convince Mark Carney to finally step off the sidelines and join the team? Because I think you're onto something, Gonda, that and there may be a way to actually showcase the entire team who's come through the leadership race, right? As part of this is the Liberal team that's going to carry you into government. Do you think he would take the bait?
I think so. I think he's put so much stake in this, and maybe I'm just I don't know him well, but and the few times I've engaged with him and all the work I see him doing, I think he's actually looking at him. There's a picture that I just saw on Twitter, and he looks like he's enjoying it now. He's laughing. He looks more coming into his own in these groups and all. I think he likes it, and
it's because he was in a car with Francois Philippe.
Today in Kitchener?
No. Okay. Last week, because we were talking about it.
Oh, okay. I'll look at the Kitchener picture today. But I was going to say that, I think he's in here. I think he's here for the long haul. Yeah. And I think he respects her. And I think, knowing her and how she connects with people, I think she could be hey, stay here and be this person for me. And I don't at this point seeing him walking away. I think that'll be a big
Yeah,
stain on him
agree.
in terms of the party and how people see him. And I don't think he'd want that. I think he actually is here for the right reasons. Or maybe I'm naive, but yeah, I think she could do that.
Well, we can always ask our guest tonight that. Joining us tonight, a senior official from the Karina Gould campaign. It's Karina Gould. Thank you for joining us, Corrina. We're not going to keep you too long. I know you've got 400,000 phone calls to make, and I know you've done a lot of other media lately as well too. So we're going to try not to duplicate the same questions. I will flag you were just on the Hurley Burly a couple days ago. Gave a great interview there, and I encourage everybody to check that out as well too. But for our interview tonight, I want to kind of start maybe towards the beginning of your political career experience. You've in a lot of other places talked about joining the Liberal Party when you were 14, helping out Patty Tornsey. I haven't heard you talk much though about kind of what came after that. So in the first 10 or 12 years as a 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19-year-old, what kept you involved in the Liberal Party during this period?
Oh, well, so I mean, I did volunteer on Patty's campaigns. And then when I went to McGill afterwards, I wasn't like formally involved with the Young Liberals there, but I did work on a number of the local campaigns in Montreal. And then when I came back, I lived in the US and then I lived in the UK, and always kind of watched from abroad. And then when I moved home in 2013, I just decided that I was going to join my local EDA again. And I was excited to defeat Stephen Harper in the 2015 election. But I wasn't thinking about running. I was just thinking I was working in Toronto, living in Burlington, and it was just to like do everything I can to get a Liberal elected again in Burlington. And as I was, volunteering on my local EDA, I was actually the electoral election readiness chair. And then I was having lunch with a mentor of mine who said to me, while we were having lunch, you're almost 30, right? And I was like, well, I'm 26. Like, I don't know what you're doing there. And she was like, well, you should really think about running. And my head was so not in that space. I said to her, like, I don't know what you're getting at. Like, I do plenty of exercise. Like, I don't need to run. And she was like, no, for office, not for exercise. And I think my jaw hit the floor. And she was like, you should think about it. You'd be great. You always talk about getting more young people, more women in politics, and you are a young woman. So it's time to walk the talk. And I went, and that was a couple of weeks before the Montreal Biennial Convention in 2014. So I was like, I better get myself to the convention and see what's going on more broadly with the party. And I decided that I wanted to run, I wanted to be part of the team. And so, yeah, that's how I got back involved.
You've talked a bit about like, conventions and party renewal and keeping people engaged. What does the party need to do to keep like young people who are out there, be they 14 or 26 or whatever? Like, what does the party need to do to keep them engaged and involved in the party?
We need to give them the space to have policy debates again. That was one of the things that got me involved in the party. It was one of the things that was exciting for me to be able to debate these ideas and have conversations with like-minded folks about what the future of our party looks like, and what the future of our country looks like. And when I think about some of the big things that we have done as liberals, a lot of them came from the party membership and a lot of them came from the Young Liberals of Canada. Like we wouldn't have same-sex marriage in this country if it wasn't for the bold idea of Young Liberals. We wouldn't have legalized cannabis, right? Like there are big things that young people and Young Liberals in particular have put forward when they weren't necessarily popular before they became mainstream. And then when we got into government at different periods of time, we enacted them. And I think it's improved Canada. So I really believe in policy conventions. I really believe in giving members the space to contribute those ideas. And I think that's how we're going to get the next big idea for our country.
Right. Well, Corrina, you've been an MP for almost a decade and a candidate before that. And what I love about politics is actually the stories. And we all have good days and we have really bad days. But could you tell me like a story of maybe it's a constituent or while you were traveling as a minister, something you heard that maybe even on the darkest days, you're like, you know what? I may be marathon voting, but I'm here for the right reasons. Like, do you have a story like that you'd like to share?
Oh, how can I pick? There's so many. like politics is hard. It is so unbelievably hard and it is a grind, but it is also the place where you can get the most done and help people in incredible ways. And if I think about, the thing that I'm most proud of in my time of politics, it's having implemented national daycare and brought forward, $10 day childcare. And I can tell you I can't even tell you the number of stories that I have from people for whom it's changed their lives. But I remember being in Nova Scotia and talking to a mom who had said that all of a sudden, because of affordable daycare, she wasn't looking at the price of chicken when she was going to the grocery store because she was saving enough money that she wasn't worried about making ends meet and she was more comfortable buying her groceries. I remember a mom in Ottawa who said to me, we hadn't, the price of childcare hadn't even gone down yet, but because she knew we signed the agreement with Ontario, she went back to work full time because she was like, now I'm going to be able to afford it. It's no longer going to be my take home paycheck. I was talking to a couple in Burlington in my community who said that because of the decrease in childcare payments, they didn't have to give up their home because their mortgage rates went up.
Wow.
Like this is like it's so real what you're able to do to help people. And I mean, the amount of stories that I can tell, like I remember being at the Legion in Burlington one Christmas and going around and talking to the different tables and talking to this one veteran who had come to me in a very dark place. But because of the investments that we made in Veterans Affairs, he had gone back to school and he was studying to be a nurse. And then I went to another table and was talking to a family who had gotten the Canada Child Benefit. And they were talking about how that meant that they could buy winter clothes for their children. And then I went to another table and a woman who was a widow was talking about the increase in the guaranteed income supplement and what that meant for her. And so like politics is really hard, but you get to do things that make meaningful differences in people's lives, and that's what keeps me going every single day. And it is like there's nothing greater than that, to know that what you're doing makes a difference and helps people.
Well, I love that. I mean, I moved to Quebec when I was 9 months pregnant for the daycare, and not everyone has that option. So I'm sure many people appreciate that. You mentioned Burlington. Like Burlington's a tough riding, as you know. What sets you apart? I remember in 2011, I was like, "Don't worry, Nav will win. Nav's gonna be fine. Nav Bains will be fine. We'll be the only ones in Peel, but we'll be fine." Nav was not fine. So, and not that we're at that point, but what sets you apart? Like for the people of Burlington, what sets you apart as an MP?
Yeah. Look, every election is tough. And I think that you have to go into every election assuming that you're starting at zero. I remember in 2015, the NDP handed out these flyers that were like, the Conservatives have this many seats and the NDP have this many and the Liberals are only at 35. So vote NDP. And I was like, every election you start at zero, right? Like you don't get to say we have this many seats and we just have to make up a few. But I think what sets me apart in Burlington is like I'm a grassroots politician. I, live in this community. People often ask me like, "Oh, what's it like to live in Ottawa?" And I was like, "I don't live in Ottawa. I work in Ottawa. I live in Burlington. My life is in Burlington." And I think that's part of it. And one of the things that I found so extraordinary when I was running in 2015 for the first time is I was like, just by virtue of being a normal person in my community, I know so many people, right? Like I went to school here. My brothers played hockey here. I danced here. My mom was a small business owner. And just by being a regular family in the community, we had so many connections. And I would knock on doors and people would be like, "Oh, my son played hockey with your brother," or your mom was my dog's vet. Like it's just, those kinds of things. My dad played old timers hockey. Like just by being part of the community and by being engaged, it was incredible, like how deep our roots were. And I think that's something that's really important is just, being part of your community and being approachable, being accessible, and being connected is something that I think makes a big difference.
So, Karina, you talked about your experience as a liberal. You've also been a caucus member, a minister, and House leader in particular. Curious your thoughts on the supply and confidence agreement. It obviously ended with the NDP. What do you think about the experiment of having collaborated with the NDP? Is that something that we should think about repeating in the future? Would you do it differently? Or are there things that we did well? I'd be curious, just as we go forward, how do we define a path as liberals in that context?
Well, I think you have to go into every election with the objective to win and win a majority. And I think that's, the objective. I think the supply and confidence agreement was good in some respects. I think it was challenging in others. Um, the part that was good about it is that it provided stability in a time of instability for Canada, and at a time when I think Canadians needed a breather post-pandemic, that, they didn't really want to be in an election in 6 months. And so I think that was something that was good. Um, we got a lot accomplished through it, but it wasn't always the liberal agenda. And so I think that that is an area too to understand. And that's not, that's kind of how minority governments can work. And, we are now the longest serving minority government in Canadian history. So that is, an important accomplishment. Um, and I think that what Canadians want to see is they actually want to see political parties work together. They want to see politicians work together. But there were also times when the what had been agreed to in the supply and confidence agreement, um, there were moments where the NDP wanted more, and that wasn't what the agreement was. And so it's, you're like, well, we literally have an agreement here. This is what you agreed
Are
to.
you
And
saying
yeah.
are you saying New Democrats don't know contract law?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if contract law would like apply
Yeah,
exactly
yeah, yeah,
in
yeah,
this space, um, but I think, like we got a lot accomplished. I think there were good things that happened, but New Democrats, like I always think what's good about being a liberal is when the conservatives say you're going too far and the NDP says you're not going far enough, you've like found the right middle centrist road. And so, I don't think it was a bad thing by any stretch. But it was definitely, I think, a new way for us to understand how we could work together and then also understand where we have strength to and where we need to say no. And that, I think there's a lot of lessons in that.
So, look, we've all been part of Team Trudeau, all four of us on this podcast. Can you maybe describe, like, what is your vision of where you would take the Liberal Party in terms of an ideas agenda, a policy agenda? What does it mean to be a liberal in your mind in 2025, especially given that you're also a millennial and, like us, a young person? Can you maybe describe a little bit about your outlook on that?
Do we still get to call ourselves young? Is that
Yes,
like...
always. Karina, always.
We've aged out of YLC, but we're still young.
Okay, good.
I'm forever young, guys.
Yeah. Um, yeah, look, I mean, I think that we're not going to win the next election by being conservative light. Like, we're going to win the next election by being liberals. And I think there is a lot of our record over the last decade that we can be really proud of. I mentioned a number of the programs, the Canada Child Benefit, childcare, the work that we did on the environment, the work that we've done on reconciliation, is so important and I think has changed this country for the better. And those are things that, I would absolutely continue with. I think where um, I would differ is maybe pulling back a bit from some of the work that we've done that's been in provincial jurisdiction. It's really hard for us as a federal government to have provinces and territories pursue our agenda because they don't like to do that. And so we also gave a lot of money to the provinces and territories, and they blamed us for a lot of the things that they're responsible for and didn't necessarily use the money in a way that would have solved those problems. So on crime and public safety, for example. I can talk about here in Ontario. Doug Ford keeps calling for bail reform. Guess what? We did that. We did that already. And when he talks, when Pierre Poilievre talks about jail, not bail, he should be talking to Doug Ford, because Doug Ford has not invested in courthouses. He has not invested in the prison system. When, people are 3 to a bunk, judges are, throwing out cases before they even get to where they need to go. So, we've given the provinces a lot of money, and they haven't necessarily delivered on the outcomes for Canadians. And so I think as a federal government, we really need to focus on the areas of jurisdiction that we have, make sure that those are top notch. And then if we are going to partner with the provinces, we need greater accountability from them. And that's something that, I was able to do in the childcare agreements. It was a $30 billion plan with the provinces and territories, but it had key objectives and outcomes and a reporting mechanism from the provinces and territories. So I would want to have greater accountability for the provinces. And, when we think about the fiscal framework, the provinces were able to balance their budget because the federal government gave them a bunch of money, and that didn't do so well for the federal balance sheet either. So that's maybe where I would differ.
Just a couple quick hits here. A lot of talk about candidates English and French in this leadership race. You also speak Spanish, correct?
Correct.
Can I give you a scenario and you can show off your Spanish for people here?
Sure, yeah.
All right. The scenario is you are Prime Minister of Canada. You are hosting the Spanish Prime Minister. They are bringing out the food. The food being served is poutine. The Spanish Prime Minister says, "What is this?" In Spanish, how do you explain poutine to the Prime Minister of Spain?
Bueno, la poutine es una comida nacional de Canadá, viene de Quebec y es muy delicioso. A mí me gusta mucho. Son papas a la francesa con queso y con jugo de carne. Yo le invito a probarlo. Yo creo que le va a gustar mucho y podemos decir que es una comida preferida de los canadienses. Entonces, buen provecho.
Cool. I mean, my only exposure is Spanish telenovelas, and that sounded really great.
Well, I speak
They're
a lot
really
of
good.
Spanish at home because my husband is Mexican.
Any other languages you want to show off while we're here?
Ich kann auch Deutsch sprechen. Also mein Deutsch ist nicht so gut, aber meine Mutter war Deutsche, also ich hatte viel Deutsch sprechen. Mehr mit meiner Mutter und meiner Großmutter, also ich kann nicht so viel sagen, aber das geht.
Well, we'll have air quotes subtitle this here. Just
Yeah.
We got the EU covered from Corrina.
Yeah.
And South America. Cool. What is your 30-second pitch to voters for why they should not vote for Pierre Poilievre?
Oh, I thought you were going to say why they should vote for me.
And give it in Spanish. No. Give it in
Yeah,
English.
well,
Give it in
yeah, I
English.
should too. I did actually. I did some Spanish media last
Oh,
week.
did great.
Yeah, in Canada. So Hispanic media
TLN.
in Canada.
Got it. Cool.
Why they shouldn't vote for Pierre Poilievre? Because he is not a serious politician and he is not able to rise to the occasion when it comes to what Canadians care about and putting the policies and programs in place that are going to make a difference for Canadians. He actually wants to cut those programs. He wants to take them away, and his policies will make life less affordable for you and take away the supports that you rely on.
Can you give us a book that you're reading at the moment or have read recently? I'm sure you don't have a lot of time on the campaign trail, but give us an insight as to what you're reading.
Yeah, so someone recently gifted me Anne Applebaum's book about dictators. So it's sitting next to me on my bed nightstand, and I'm looking forward to reading it. The last book I read was The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Okay.
What is...
That was a while ago, though.
Yeah, understandable. What is your favorite TV show that your kids watch?
Bluey.
That was the correct answer. I was hoping for that.
Yeah. Oh,
What's
I
your
love
favorite
it.
episode of Bluey? Can you go a little deeper?
Oh, my favorite. Well, I don't know if it's my favorite, but it's my son's favorite is the birthday party episode where they do pass the present.
Oh,
And
yes.
so at he had a little party at the end of school last year, and that was really important that he had passed the present in it. And yeah, he just like I feel like he gets so inspired by it. Like all of our doors in our house have numbers on them because he wants to play hotel like in Bluey.
Nice.
Yeah, I love it. What a great show. And it's a great show for kids, but it's also really nice for parents. So
I understand none of these references as a kid. I have kids.
you should honestly, you don't need to have kids, just
It's
watch it.
true.
It's so
Or you
lovely.
can come hang with our kids and then you can watch it with them.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, okay, Karina, it's Friday night, snow campaign. Kids are in bed. You have no plans Saturday morning. What are you doing for fun?
What? No plans Saturday
There's
morning?
no plans
I
Saturday.
never.
No, yeah, but what I'm saying, this is an alt universe. Like, what are you
Oh,
doing
like
for fun?
an alternate universe?
Alternate universe. Friday
I'm
night,
going.
kids in bed, no plans Saturday. What are you
Oh,
doing?
Friday night, not Saturday
Friday
morning.
night, Friday night, yeah.
Okay, because I was like Saturday morning I'm going for a hike on the Bruce Trail.
Oh, that's good.
On Friday night I am probably watching Netflix. Yeah.
She's getting caught up on her Bluey. It's obvious.
I really like The Diplomat.
Diplomat's really good.
That's really good. Oh, I guess if it's Friday night, oh, kids are in bed. Yeah, so yeah, I'm at home. I'm watching Netflix.
Veep or West Wing?
Oh, oh. I love Veep. Like I love Veep, and I recently when I became house leader, I rewatched a lot of West Wing because I wanted to like
Ooh.
get the strategy
Oh.
and see what was going on. So
You're going to get some points, I think, from some liberals for that answer.
yeah.
Excellent. Okay, well, because we didn't want to keep you too long here. You got a lot of phone calls to make, but we'll give you a minute here to kind of give a pitch to any registered liberals out there who are listening. Why should they vote for Karina Gould and or donate money to your campaign? What's your pitch to liberals right now?
Well, I think it's time for the next generation of leadership. I think we have a tremendous opportunity as liberals right now to reconnect and re-engage with Canadians. We need to re-earn their trust for the upcoming election, and we need someone who is able to go head to head with Pierre Poilievre. That person is me. I've been doing it to great effect over the last 18 months as the House leader, and we need someone who's going to be able to win this next election. And so there's just so much opportunity for us as liberals. I'm excited about this prospect. We have a great vision that we can share with Canadians, but we have to listen to them and we have to make sure that we're including them in this process. So if you like what you hear, join my campaign, register, commit to vote, make a donation and volunteer because we've got a lot of building to do, but I'm really optimistic about the future.
Well, thanks for joining us, Karina.
Thanks for having me. This is fun.
It's time to stop the clock. So this is at the end of every episode. We like to give a shout out to somebody who did something really well or not so well this week. Who wants to kick us off and give a bit of a shout out to someone here?
I'll go first. It's actually a shout out to all the Liberal leadership candidates. I was really impressed that they issued a joint statement basically saying we will all stand up on Team Canada to Donald Trump and these tariffs. They didn't get into policy. I don't think that was the moment in time for it, but they clearly made the case that, the Liberal leadership place is not going to be a place for division on this question. And I think it was important because it was kind of reflecting the moment of where the country was, that we wanted a unity and a lot of people weren't going to give a lot of quarter to those who had a different view.
I will go at it from my tour and operations perspective, but I'm looking at a picture of Mark Carney on my phone, and it's a aerial view, and I wish I can share this, but he is surrounded by people. He's not wearing a tie. He has a handheld mic, and he is surrounded. Everyone's laughing. There's people from all types of backgrounds behind him. And a second picture, he's at some sort of manufacturing plant, I think. He has a like a vest on with like a little piece that shows that he's like cocky. I'm thinking like what this picture says to me is Canadian workers. So I think from an operations imagery standpoint for this week, Mark Harney's team, they nailed it.
Yeah, and I'll go a little bit outside the leadership race just because I think he had a really good week and give it out to our former boss, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. I've had a lot of people come up to me in the last couple of days who are not liberals who said, like, I listened to the Prime Minister speak Saturday and I was actually inspired. It made me feel like we're all in this together. And I think, look, for somebody who has kind of built a bit of a legacy around getting the country through difficult times and difficult situations, this is a good final act for that story. And I think he's handled it well, not just in terms of the delivery and the speech, but even just, coming out with a strong retaliatory package, which I think helped push Trump a bit away from escalating things, but not going so far that we ended up, threatening an export tax, which would have done a lot of harm to national unity. They brought in the measures back in December, which gave Trump a fig leaf to back down as well, too. So both in terms of just delivery and in terms of substance, I think this was really well handled. Good job, Prime Minister, on this one.
I think his tone was right too. And I'll share a funny story. Every Saturday, everyone knows my house. The only thing that plays is Hockey Night in Canada. It is just not an option. I've tried, but that's what it plays. And my husband watches it with and his friends. They have this group chat, and he was like talking about, I don't know, a goal or something happened, and they're like, "Oh, we're watching the Trudeau presser," and he was like, "What?" And none of his friends are liberal. So hey, I think it tells how many Canadians are in tune to this. So yeah, I agree with you, Dan.
Excellent. Well, thanks to our listeners for doing their patriotic duty and listening to a Canadian podcast this week. We'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, Airbnb, and we'll see you next week on the next leg of the Race to Replace.